Hi, everyone. This is episode 690 of the People Behind the Science podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today I'm looking forward to revisiting our conversation with our guest, Dr. Barry Byrne, originally published on December 12th of 2016. Listeners, Barry is a physician specializing in pediatric cardiology, as well as a scientist studying rare neuromuscular diseases, which may cause problems such as muscle weakness, uncoordinated movements, difficulty speaking, and heart problems. He balances his roles treating patients and conducting research aimed at developing new therapies for these conditions. And in this episode, Barry shares fantastic stories from his own life and science. So listeners, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, our wonderful guest is Dr. Barry Byrne. So, Barry, welcome to our show. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are delighted to have you with us today, and we're excited to learn more about you and your work. But first, let me take a moment to introduce you to our listeners. So, listeners, Barry is the director of the Powell Gene Therapy Center, professor of pediatrics and molecular genetics and microbiology, the Earl and Christy Powell University Chair in Genetics, and also Associate Chair of Pediatrics at the University of Florida. He received his bachelor's in chemistry from Denison University and his M.D. and Ph.D. in microbiology and immunology from the University of Illinois. He then completed his residency as well as his postdoctoral and clinical fellowships at Johns Hopkins University. And Barry started his career as a faculty member at Johns Hopkins before joining the faculty at the University of Florida in 1997. And listeners, Barry's excellence in research has been recognized throughout his career through receipt of various awards, including the Faculty Research Prize in Clinical Research and the Research Professor Award from the University of Florida, as well as the Clinician Scientist Award from Johns Hopkins University. And listeners, Barry is here with us today to talk about his experiences in life and in the lab. So we want to get to know you, Barry, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not working?
Oh, that's a good question, because often the things that are in front of us, both in science and in medicine and clinical care, can consume your time. But my family is a priority. I do enjoy sports and outside activities. So cycling, hiking have been fun hobbies over the years.
Definitely. And now it's probably a wonderful time to get outside now that it's a little cooler down there in Florida.
Correct. Yes, it actually is fall. We have a very brief fall, but right as of today is cool.
Fantastic. Well, great to hear a little bit about how you like to spend your time when you're not working. I think getting outside, getting a breath of fresh air and escaping from the lab every now and then is definitely a good choice.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about your work next and how you describe what you do to someone who has no familiarity with your field?
Well, I often try to relate my day-to-day activity to that of a teacher because as an academic clinician scientist, a lot of what we do is educating students at various levels, whether they're undergraduate students or graduate students or postdoctoral students. We all actually, in the practice of medicine at least, are students for, in some ways, your whole career. So trainees come through our sphere at every level. And I think that many people can relate to that. On a day-to-day basis, it's hard to say what the responsibilities are because no 2 days are actually the same. That's what makes it interesting and fun.
Definitely. And I think you can go in with an exact plan of how your day is going to go, and it never works out that way.
That's exactly correct.
Well, and I really like this point you brought up of almost being a lifelong learner. And I absolutely agree with that. As a faculty member myself, I still find that even though I'm now, quote unquote, the expert in some of the things, I'm still learning new things every single day.
That's entirely true.
Definitely. So can you tell us a little bit next about what motivates you? I think there's a lot to get done as a researcher and also balancing, in your case, the clinician side and the scientist side. So what keeps you going? And do you have a favorite quote or a saying to embody this?
Well, I do think that when we make the focus of our interests to be to solve or understand patient problems, and when patients are at the center of that scientific question, which is a great privilege to have as having had clinical training and trying to understand problems from the perspective of a patient. That's really the motivation that helps, I think, everyone in our endeavor to prioritize their work based on what matters most to patients. So that's been an approach that I've taken. And I think even those that don't have any clinical experience, they have life experience and they know what people aspire to and what is a challenge and what are their greatest hopes to have a productive life. So, and this is especially true for children. So as a practitioner in pediatrics, we really have that in mind every day when we approach the kind of problems we're addressing in the lab.
Definitely. And I think keeping that in mind, the people that you're doing the research for is so important because that can help you decide what are the most important questions to answer right now.
Exactly. And we try to accomplish that by having lunch meetings, some opportunity for bench scientists to meet patients and their families and hear from them what's important to them.
Well, I think that is a great example of connecting these two halves of the equation, getting the patients to actually literally sit down together with the scientists to have these conversations. So I'm really glad to hear that. And now I would like to chat a little bit next about some of the people, Barry, who you might have encountered over the course of your career who may have inspired you to pursue science and medicine. So are there role models or people who come to mind?
In my early clinical career, we were all lucky in the Department of Pediatrics to have at Hopkins to have an amazing mentor in Frank Oskey. And as Frank really motivated everyone to think creatively and to challenge conventional wisdom. So I would say Frank was one of the people I admired most. Also, Kathy DeAngelis was the residency program director at the time I started, went on to even greater things in her career to ultimately become the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association. And they both really challenged us to think creatively and care and be passionate about patients. Scientifically, I feel like I've had many outstanding mentors. In fact, in some ways, I could say every interaction we have on the science side, whether it's with a student or a senior faculty member, challenges you to think about a problem in a new way. But certainly in our current focus in the gene therapy work we do, really one of my very profound scientific mentors has been Nick Maziska, who's a senior faculty at the University of Florida, who helped discover the exact strategies we're using to treat genetic diseases.
Gotcha. Well, Barry, it sounds like you have had some wonderful mentors and people to kind of look up to and wonderful colleagues to work with there. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about where this interest in science and medicine began. So can you take us all the way back to the beginning of your story, Barry, and tell us where did it all start?
Well, as a high school student, and I do recall kind of having a fascination with science and medicine, there was actually no one in my family who has any involvement in the field of medicine. There are humanists in my family, but not those that kind of had any scientific background. So at least that personal side of it, I'd say my mom was certainly contributed to that understanding of kind of empathy. My dad is a businessman, and I think it just was being around people, particularly my high school biology teacher was a strong motivator to be interested in these topics. And it was just a natural curiosity. And then in college, I really had a great collection of teachers, particularly my chemistry professor, Gordon Galloway, was a motivator in many ways. And throughout college and postgraduate education, I stayed in touch with Gordon. That got me started. I then majored in chemistry at Denison University, where it's a very small school. It was easy to know the faculty well and develop role models there. There were aspects of, though, that undergraduate education that I didn't see. It was mostly focused on biology, and the engineering and other aspects of science were really, I didn't learn until much later. But then coming back to Chicago to go to graduate school and medical school, I was able to develop an interest in really was an emerging field at the time. Molecular biology was really a new science. There were ways in which it could be applied to understanding diseases, but it really was the timing was really perfect to apply those ideas to what now is considered this genomic revolution that we're in, where we have access to so much information about what causes disease. I couldn't have predicted that 20 years ago.
Certainly. Now, you mentioned you went to Denison, which is kind of a small undergraduate institution. And were you able to get laboratory experience there?
Yeah, I remember kind of one of the motivations for becoming a fellow in the chemistry department is you actually, they gave us keys to the whole department and we got a special office. And, that was a great opportunity to kind of be the bigwig in the department. And so that exactly small environment was a lot of fun because, as I said, you get to know the faculty. Gordon is somewhat known throughout my education, and then other faculty who even had for one class. I was invited back there for rededication of the chemistry department building, and one of my professors from organic chemistry class said, "Oh, I was so glad to know you were coming. I went and pulled out my grade book from your class in advanced organic chemistry." He said, "Do you remember what grade you got in my class?" And I was shaking my head. I said, "Oh, no, I'm pretty sure I got a B in that class." And he said, "Well, you're right." He was very proud of himself for being a tough professor.
Well, I went to a small undergraduate institution myself, and I had a fantastic experience. I think you're absolutely right. This personal connection that you have with faculty, and I still keep in touch with many of them years later. So wonderful to hear more about this experience. And you mentioned that you had started getting interested in science and starting getting interested in medicine. Did you know at the time that you were going into pediatrics, or when did this decision come to play?
I think one learned early on the division in medical practice between surgery and medicine. I had good experiences in adult medical practice, but I really kind of drawn to what are more frequently found among children, the genetic diseases that can be well defined by understanding the scientific basis of the condition. I think there's still always a bigger challenge from multifactorial conditions that are acquired. Whereas those things that are inherited, we often understand very well exactly the cause of the problem. And that gives us an idea of how to specifically attack those problems and make a big change where the other conditions there may be less impactful therapies for.
Certainly. So we've heard a little bit about your journey now, Barry, to how you got to where you are today. Can you tell us a little bit more about a project that you're working on right now that you are the most excited about?
Well, that's not fair because it's like asking who's your favorite child.
Of course. I promise I won't ask that.
but I do think that a lot of the projects that have been maturing over the past few years and are moving now quickly from the bench research into the clinic are great examples. Even though a lot of our focus has been on neuromuscular diseases, and particularly the category of muscular dystrophies, there is another form of neuromuscular disease that we're studying that I'll give you some background on. But for example, for a number of years now, for the past 10 years, we've been working on a form of muscular dystrophy known as Pompe disease. Those studies have led us to understand the basic causes of the disease, the particulars of the gene that leads to Pompe and treatment strategies. And then, in fact, we're pursuing what could be a very high-impact curative therapy at the NIH Clinical Center in Bethesda starting this coming summer that we've been working on for the past 2 years to get ready for. That has helped us contribute to even a much larger population of patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And through a federal grant, we've now been able to merge that activity with a biotechnology company based in Boston. Also, a very important stimulus for that is the passionate input of a parent who began that company, and the concept of the parent entrepreneur has really also been seen in Pompe and in many rare diseases, and in this case in Duchenne. And I'm excited about that because the magnitude of the project, because of the frequency of the problem, should really help this patient population, for which is really the most frequent that we see in our neuromuscular clinic. So I think that will be very high impact. And then another project, which is really just at its earliest stages, but I think is also, because of the prior experience with these other programs, is moving very quickly, is on another condition called Friedreich's ataxia. We've really been so blessed to work with an outstanding organization in the Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, and the principals there, the founder, Ron Bartak, and the director, Jen Farmer, have just been a joy to work with. And like in every patient population, there are just always special people that you meet and are motivating us to move quickly and develop effective treatments. So that's been true of a family in our own community here who was really the stimulus that said, why don't you take what you've done in these other areas and bring those ideas to the treatment of Friedreich's? And the Boutin family was a stimulus for that, and that's helped us get started. And then the wider organization of patients, they really all are rowing, pulling in the same direction, which is really encouraging. So that's, I think, going to be, as it develops, with the help of our other faculty. This Friedreich's project is led by Dr. Manuela Corti. We have an international collaboration with GOFAR, Friedreich's Association, like FARA in Italy. And so all those things are kind of, the stars are lining up, I hope, for that patient community. And so we're excited about that.
Well, that sounds like you have a lot of phenomenal projects going on. And I think, like you said, it's easy to stay motivated sometimes, especially if you're seeing these people every day who your research has the potential to help. Now, can you paint a picture for our listeners out there who might not be familiar with Friedreich's ataxia or Pompe disease or Duchenne muscular dystrophy even? What do these diseases look like?
Well, Friedreich's ataxia is a form of movement disorder. There is a change in the gene called frataxin that impacts the ability of particularly the sensory neurons and the heart to process energy. So this abnormality then leads to uncoordinated movement, difficulty speaking, often a diminished hearing, and the most challenging, I think, long-term for patients, this is the problem that is in the heart of the patients where they have an increased thickness of the heart muscle, and this ultimately leads to the biggest clinical challenge they face, early mortality from cardiac disease. So it's amazing what patients can do to compensate for these difficulties. Sometimes they become non-ambulant, but they always have the best outlook of many of the patients we've encountered. So despite all their challenges, they're optimistic about the future. And that's what's fun to work on this and try to harness that enthusiasm towards an effective treatment.
Definitely. And I think every scientist's career is fraught with challenges and struggles. And I haven't yet met an exception, Barry. I suspect you're perhaps not one of them. But can you tell us one of these stories of challenge or one of the failures or frustrations that you've faced along the course of your career? Because I think these are so important to share with the public so that everyone kind of has a sense of what life is really like as a scientist.
Yeah, well, as well planned as one might have a timeline, we have to try to make those expectations match reality. So I guess what may be frustrating, in particular to patients, is the speed at which we can move these programs forward. Of course, when we start to interact with the regulatory agencies, and particularly the FDA, their mandate is to make sure not just that therapeutic strategies are effective, but first and foremost, that they're safe. So a lot of what we have to do to demonstrate to the best we can safety in any of these ideas involves some animal testing. These are often lengthy, sometimes more than 1 or 2 year programs that are in preparation for the clinical studies that we're doing currently. So I guess those delays are sometimes frustrating, and we just have to keep kind of our eye on the ball and think about the long-term outcomes. And that's starting to come to light for a variety of conditions. I think one of the first examples we had in this area was in the gene therapy approaches to inherited vision problems or inherited blindness. In fact, this therapeutic approach had really high impact in a study we did with the University of Pennsylvania, and the work of Sam Jacobs and Bill Hausworth at Florida showed that if we restored a gene in a condition called Leber's congenital amaurosis, that it actually in some of the patients could recover their vision that had been lost years earlier. So this was one of the first bits of encouragement in this field that there could be therapeutic successes.
Well, it's really exciting to hear that we're getting to that point where you're starting to be able to deliver targeted therapeutics that are really improving the quality of life for these people. Now, you're studying relatively rare diseases. Do you have any challenges related to the small numbers of people who might have these diseases, or do these sorts of things maybe contribute to some of the delays that you see?
That's a very important question because, to really change medical practice, it's valuable to have done a small confirmatory or really significant clinical study. But to make that discovery enduring, really one needs to work with a commercial partner to be able to produce a therapeutic long-term that comes out of the research environment and goes into the regular practice of medicine. In the rare disease field, there are many conditions which kind of meet the threshold that might be commercially viable, or where there's an interest, a sufficient interest by a pharmaceutical company. In the ultra-orphan diseases that maybe even only a few hundred or fewer patients, they may not meet that threshold. But yet they're still as really every bit as deserving to have access to these therapies. So that's one of the things we're really struggling with right now is how do we develop a model in which any patient population would have these therapeutic approaches accessible to them. And I guess that's somewhat of an economics question, but that does influence the science because we have a limit to what we can do through federal funding. And again, to make it durable or enduring therapy that changes medical practice, we need to have that available commercially.
Absolutely. Well, I think you brought up some really important challenges for your field, and I'm really glad we discussed these today. But we don't just want to dwell on the challenges and the stressful times, Barry. I do want to hear next about one of your own successes. And this can be a big win or even just a small one that meant a lot to you personally.
I think even though we know that the concept of a single gene could be a single drug for a rare disease, that's obviously important to acknowledge that and to see that and put into practice. But one of the challenges that is always faced when we try to bring a therapeutic strategy to the clinic is we have to make enough of the product, of the material to study. And this is where some basic virology becomes a big part of understanding of how we manufacture biopharmaceuticals. And so we've had the good fortune to have a facility at the university where we can make those biopharmaceutical reagents as drugs under the most stringent conditions to meet the safety requirements. But the science really lagged behind the need, and we kept finding favorable results with more and more of these materials or larger subjects and had a need to make more of the product. So I guess that's one of my, I think will be an enduring contribution is that our team that focuses on this, Natalie Clement, who directs the Vector Core, and Brian Cleaver, who's our operational director in the center, have put a tremendous amount of personal energy into making this work for every size patient population. So where we can either teach a contract manufacturing group how to do this or do these procedures internally in our own smaller facility with some of our foundation funds, that will enable both the smallest and the largest indications to have access to the materials. And I guess even though that's seems like a reagent and not very interesting, it did require a lot of scientific thought and input and successes of repetitive hard work to get it to be successful. So that's a win, I would say, for the team.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations to you and your team on this success. And I think some of these, like you said, it may not sound exciting, but developing this process to create these materials is going to have a huge impact on all the projects downstream.
Yeah, and not just ours, but we share that information with the whole field to make sure that it's available to everyone.
Definitely. Well, fantastic success there. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And I know we've talked a little bit about your life outside of science and some of the things you like to do, get outside, spend time with your family. And I love talking to scientists about what they're reading for fun as well. I know it's hard to escape the literature and the scientific papers for a little while, but I've been trying to fit more reading time into my life. So Barry, do you have a book recommendation that you can pass on to me and our listeners today?
Well, I do tend to read a lot of work-related stories, and so my casual reading is more science-y, and I really did enjoy the book The Cure by Geeta Anand, partly because we had some role in that story, and it was fun to see it develop, and then ultimately the screenplay became a movie called Extraordinary Measures.
Excellent. Well, we will definitely put that recommendation on our website for our listeners to find The Cure. And I understand, I think you're being modest here in talking about how you may have had a connection with this movie, Extraordinary Measures. It sounds like one of the characters, actually the main character, might have been based off of you, if I understand it correctly.
Well, there were a lot of contributors to that story. And, we had a great collaboration with Bill Canfield, who really is the principal of motivation behind the scientific character in the book. But it was one of those team efforts, so I was really happy to be part of it.
Definitely. And I was doing a little bit of reading up before our interview, and it sounds like they had the big movie premiere, and you were actually able to walk the red carpet in New York. What was that like?
Well, I've never been to any of those kinds of events before, and so it was really fun to see how well the film was received. And got to meet a few people who, particularly the principals in the movie, it was great to watch how a movie's made. I'm kind of a fan of movies, and I never imagined the complexity of it, but it was a kind of a cool experience. That's true.
Gotcha. Did you get to shake hands with Harrison Ford?
We got to meet Harrison Ford and
Ooh.
Brendan Fraser, and Carrie Russell was so gracious. She was really, I think, probably one of the standouts in the movie.
That's awesome. I know Indiana Jones was one of my heroes as a kid, so Harrison Ford is like one of my idols. But Fantastic to hear a little bit more about this experience, and wonderful to hear, again, how science is able to be disseminated through movies like this to the public to kind of make people more invested in a field like yours. So can you tell us a little bit about how you played into maybe some of the scientific advising within that movie?
I think you're exactly right. It's in many different ways. The popular press helps educate the public about the complexity of science. And sometimes to take a 5 or 6 year story and compress it down into 90 minutes is challenging, or in some cases, a life of work. So often there's some artistic license that's needed to get there. But I think what impressed me about this complex story is they really did try to depict a lot of the details that made it fairly accurate. And that shows how sciences can flow back and forth between the laboratory and patients, and what was learned from patients goes back to the laboratory again to try to improve and make it better. And then the humanistic side of a parent who's struggling to do the best they can for their child. That I think everyone can relate to. In fact, the producers, Michael Schemberg, put together an opportunity for various rare disease groups to contribute to a small video blog that was conducted as part of the movie release. And just watching some of those stories from a diverse patient population really tells you how they're sending common elements to the struggles that patients face when they have chronic problems. But they're always willing to find hope and the prospect of a better life that motivates people.
Certainly. And I think watching these stories of patients is really inspiring. It makes you appreciate a lot of the things that you take for granted in everyday life.
That's for sure.
So thank you so much for telling us more about this amazing experience. And I do also want to talk about some of the opportunities you've had to travel as a scientist. I think this is an integral part of the job, being able to go to different places, share your science, and work with different scientists. So Barry, is there one maybe standout travel experience that sticks out in your mind? And can you tell us where you were and why?
Well, a group that was trying to build awareness and advocate on behalf of patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy was motivated by one of our friends and patients here in the Gainesville community who felt like if we could do something huge, we could demonstrate our challenges of putting kind of one foot in front of the other to overcome the problems, that one way to do that would be to go on some epic mountain climbing activities. So with a little fearful, but I was motivated by the patients, we went on 3 different climbs as part of awareness for Duchenne. And the first one turned out to be actually the hardest. So in 2009, we went to Washington and climbed Mount Rainier as a team of 12, I think, participants. And it's amazing the beauty of that place and the focus that one needs, the mental and physical ability you need. It's really actually in some ways more of a mental challenge than a physical challenge, but only about half of anyone who attempts this usually makes their way up and back down. And of course, they say it doesn't matter if you get to the top if you don't get back again.
Right.
We're focused on that. And that was a very enduring memory because you just stand there and see forever and understand kind of how anything is possible if you can do that. So that was certainly the view of the parents who helped contribute to that, who came along on that trip. We then went to Grand Teton the next year, also a very beautiful part of the country, probably a little more perilous, but not as physically challenging. And then the last one we did most recently was to go to Kilimanjaro. And at least that was one of the 8 continental peaks that was on my bucket list.
Mm-hmm. And
being in Tanzania, you get to see some aspects of the world and how we met other patients who were from Africa, and you see how lucky in some ways we are in this country to have advanced medical care. You really get to appreciate the basics under those circumstances. And each trip had its own unique aspects and rewards.
Absolutely. Well, I'm first of all very glad to hear you made it not only all the way back up, but all the way back down on each of these epic mountain climbing trips. So do you have your next mountain picked out? Are you going to do it again?
Actually, the degree of difficulty gets a little harder once you go past some of into the other continents, and not many mountains above 20,000 feet. So taken to sort of sticking on dry land now and on the flat. So one of the other fun things we've been doing with the Friedreich's group is they have really developed this idea of the ride ataxia. And so our group has really been having fun and joining people like Kyle Bryant, who initiated that program for FARA. Kyle is an amazing young man and actually decided he was going to make this his own signature demonstration of what you can overcome with a movement disorder like Friedreich's. And actually, Kyle, several years ago, did the Race Across America with a young man with FA and two of their friends. So the four of them rode across the U.S. in 9 days. So I might try that. That would be fun.
That sounds like a great next adventure. I like it. Well, fantastic to hear about some of these experiences that you've had and that they're certainly contributing to such a great cause, being able to raise awareness for these different diseases. So thanks so much for sharing your experiences. And throughout these, you've kind of been hinting at some of the people who've been a part of these groups, either traveling with you or the people that you've been working with in the lab. And I think the people are part of what makes science so amazing. And I think there's so many different personalities. There's no one way that a scientist should be. And we love to showcase these different personalities on our show by talking about some of the quirky traditions that spring up in different laboratories or just the fun things that scientists do together. So, Barry, do you have another story that you can share with us that kind of shows this human side of science?
I would say we're a pretty tame group, although, we've seen...
I know you're climbing mountains and...
At work, I think people have a lot of fun. Everyone enjoys each other's company. And I do think maybe it emphasizes the fact that I always try to be mindful of the fact this is really a team sport. Without everyone's participation at every level, it really wouldn't happen. And so there's no one contribution that's more important than the next. And so in that sense, we do try to have fun. I don't know that we have any unique bent on that, although we're trying to start another tradition. In Baltimore, we used to have an annual Halloween party. And actually, it was one of the traditions the Crowleys, who are part of the Cure, have embraced. So we're thinking we may launch the first annual Halloween party this year and try to keep that up as a good tradition.
Ooh, well, I think that sounds fantastic. And I love this idea of really taking the time to celebrate and enjoy everyone's different contributions to the group. And I think that is so important. Everyone from the maintenance people who are helping keep your lab clean all the way up to the primary investigator of the lab, they are all an important part of the team that's making it happen. So
absolutely
great to hear that. And I'm curious to hear more about this Halloween party. Why a Halloween party in particular? Was there enthusiasm about the costumes?
We have some of our therapists are really avid Halloween fans. So we said, okay, if you guys can help organize it, we're going to have a Halloween party. So that we'll see in a week what happens.
Yeah. Do you have your costume already picked out, Barry, or is it a surprise?
I have an idea.
Yeah.
I'm not revealing it, though. It's a secret.
All right. Excellent. You'll have to report back afterwards and let us know how it goes.
I'll send photos.
I love it. Well, very fantastic to hear about your research group and this newfound tradition that you're going to be establishing starting this year. And I think it's fun not only to chat with your members of your lab outside of the sort of formal lab environment about the different things they've got going on in their life, but I feel like it often reverts back to the big questions that you're all so passionate about in the lab. So I love talking to scientists about these big questions that are burning in their minds. And I'm curious, Barry, if I gave you everything today, no barriers, funding, staff, technology, feasibility, you've got it all. What is the question that you would try and tackle first?
Well, we know that if we've solved the problems of making biopharmaceutical agents, we know that we're relying on ways to transfer genes into cells to correct genetic disease. There is one challenge, and it's the very clever immune system that we all have, and that hasn't been surmounted yet, that problem of immunity in recessive diseases and certainly immunity to the agents that we are using to carry genes into cells. So I think we'd focus our efforts on conquering that aspect. I kind of make the analogy, this was the challenge that was faced by folks in the transplant field in the early 80s. Transplant immunology has developed into a science that has helped establish what's safe and how one can preserve function of allografts that are used in whether it's the heart or the liver or the kidney. And I think we're transplanting genes in a way in this field of gene therapy. So we maybe will take some lessons from there. It's actually probably a slightly simpler problem overall, I think.
Really?
So we're focusing on one thing instead of this whole host of differences that might have existed between the donor and the recipient. And we have the time to plan it out, unlike in transplantation. So I think that would be the focus of what we would do over the next few years, because I think it would make sure that we have the most long-lasting results That can be a consequence of inflammation against new gene product, which is what's needed in treating the disease. And so that's I think, one of our biggest challenges.
Certainly. And I'm really glad you brought this up. This is something that was a fascinating problem where the immune system, which normally helps you, is now kind of getting in the way of you being able to treat these patients. And it's I've never really thought of that aspect of immunology being a problem within this context of gene therapy. So very cool. So now we've talked a little bit about the different experiences you've had and some of the different people that you've had an opportunity to work with over the course of your career. And I think some of these people are amazing sources of advice and amazing mentors, as we heard many of the examples you mentioned today. So Barry, is there one piece of advice that really sticks out in your mind, though, as one that really helped you in a tough time that you want to pass on to our listeners today?
Well, one of my clinical mentors used to say, it's better to be lucky than good. I have a feeling she was right.
Yeah.
So that does come to mind now and then.
So do you feel like you've been particularly lucky in science and medicine?
I think so. Certainly from a timing perspective, we're at a period because of discoveries of many people in this field and an evolution of how the pharmaceutical industry views this science, that this will come to fruition because we know that the only approved biopharmaceutical of gene therapy was in Europe. So we're really waiting to see whether we can establish the proof that these are safe, effective, and long-lasting approaches to this unique disease population in the U.S. And so that lies before us. But I think you can kind of see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. And I think patients certainly share that enthusiasm now.
Definitely. I think it's a really exciting time to be working in the field. So fantastic little tidbit of advice there. It's better to be lucky than good. We'll try and keep ourselves on the good side of luck here, listeners.
Right.
And Barry, is there any other last piece of advice or a last note of inspiration that you want to leave our listeners with today?
I guess I just draw on this kind of common theme that often emerges from patients and it's amazing how they draw on what often is very desperate circumstances that they might face, but they always have hope. And that hope, I think, encourages us all to think about what is possible. I think you asked about anything that you think of that can be inspirational. And I always feel like if you can dream it, you can do it. And that was something Walt Disney said. I think we can bring from that fantasy world to science and say that when we put our minds to it, we can accomplish so much. So let's pair that hope with those aspirations or dreams. I think that we can't go wrong.
Definitely. Well put, Barry. And I think you're absolutely right. These things that maybe scientists hundreds of years ago could only dream of, we're absolutely doing today. So that's the future. Things that we're dreaming up now, we'll be able to do in the future. We just need to keep being perseverant, keep working towards it. So fantastic messages to leave our listeners with today. Barry, can you tell them now, if they want to learn more about you and your work, where should they go?
Our department has a website, research.pediatrics.ufl.edu. Certainly Google works. You'll be able to find any of the clinical studies that are underway on clinicaltrials.gov. And look forward to hearing from any of the listeners who want more information or find that these ideas might apply to their own area of interest.
Absolutely. Well, listeners, definitely learn more about Barry's research and reach out if you have any questions for Barry. And Barry, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your life in science.
Thank you so much. It was fun.
Well, it's been a pleasure to chat with you as well. And listeners, thank you for spending time with us today. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.